I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity, love politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
Folks, we're bringing a face-to-face recording to you right now. Dean and I are recording over Zoom, and we can see each other both as we speak. And I got to tell you, it's unnerving. This is not how podcasts should work. We should be talking sort of blankly to a screen, but here we are able to see one another, and it's a whole different energy.
You know what? It is funny. This is we're really pulling back the curtain on the production process here. I don't know why this is. I feel like this is actually the real kind of revelation that we are millennials in particular. When we record this podcast, we don't do it by video. We do it by audio. It's like being on the phone, looking at your computer for an hour. I don't know why it is, but that's the way it is. And it is weird to see each other. I mean, we've recorded episodes in person, which is also kind of weird. It's a different energy, but it is bizarre to see one another.
Truly. Well, anyways, what's not bizarre is how good David Driedger's book, Nothing Will Save Us, A Theology of Immeasurable Life is. Folks, we've got a very cool interview with... Folks, we've got a very cool interview with David Driedger, and he's going to talk about his book. He's going to talk about... structural violence, some big ideas about immeasurable life, which is a rad term that you're going to get very familiar with very soon. We're talking about Canada and the Mennonites and Thomas Muntzer even. So hold on to your butts. This is going to be a great episode. And when it's over, you can go buy David's book. Today on the show, we're joined by David C.L. Driedger, Mennonite pastor and author of Nothing Will Save Us, A Theology of Immeasurable Life. David, thanks so much for being on the show. Whenever we have an author on, we always ask them to give an elevator pitch for their work just to get us started. So you can imagine that you're in a very tall building with a very slow elevator and give us the pitch for this big book that you've got.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. And great to be here, guys. Yeah, I think as we'll talk about, the book has come about in a variety of formations in the various parts and chapters, but in the end, I found it to be sort of a corrective to the question of authority and judgment as I've tended to experience it, namely sort of a conservative tendency towards the abuse of authority against a constructed enemy, and what I increasingly found to be the liberal tendency towards a sort of almost abdication, but a type of assimilating authority with sort of an internal judgment. We'll welcome you in, but you got to play by our house rules. And so kind of dissatisfied with that, I found myself sort of putting together what I thought is an identifiable biblical trajectory that critiques the human tendencies towards the abuses of authority, attempts to kind of control the ultimate measures of life, which I in the Bible call idolatry. And so that it points us to alternatives to this inevitable kind of human tendency that can keep the church and the world accountable. And so those are sites, holy sites that I call sites of the immeasurable.
Yeah, it
Nice.
is
Oh,
really fun. There's a lot of different moving parts in the book. I feel like you take off in many different directions that are also directions we've tried to follow on this podcast. So I feel like folks who've listened for a long time to this show will find different points of contact that will be familiar and new and interesting. And I want to talk maybe a little bit even about that form of the book, and we can get into the content a little more in a minute. There's a kind of neat non-linear approach, you could say, that you have. Chapters kind of build on each other, but you also have lots of distinct themes, topics. Some chapters are a bit more autobiographical. Some are dealing a little more with kind of the weeds of different scholars and so on. So I think that's also kind of a nice book to engage. You can figure out, I guess, your mood and find the chapter that corresponds. And you talk in the book, too, about how important there was a kind of like 2000s blogosphere of folks talking about theology and philosophy that was formative for your thinking too. So maybe, I mean, are those things related at all? Like that kind of, yeah, way of just doing kind of nonlinear thought, getting a lot of topics in the mix and seeing how they go. Is that kind of a,
Yeah.
part of that formation over time? And how did this book come about? How did those conversations maybe lead to something like this?
Yeah, I've certainly recognized that I'm kind of an occasional writer and an occasional thinker. I'm not a very systematic thinker, so I don't have a big project that I figure out how to work through. I find that I sort of stumble upon systematic or philosophical systems and then try to engage them in my context. But yeah, no, it's pretty funny to think we're like a solid 20 years on from sort of the heyday of theology blogging, and a lot of us were undergrads, maybe just starting graduate programs, and now there's senior established published scholars that were in those circles, and yeah, that was formative. I didn't grow up with an academic background in my household. I didn't actually know a lot about post-secondary education, and really followed it step by step in terms of I grew up in a rural religious community, and the church was just that was the place where you could ask big questions. And I found that appealing, and so it was very kind of step by step, and it was the exposure of these theology blogs, which forever, in hindsight, we can see the overconfident bravado that sometimes accompanied some of that. But there was some hard edges of thought, I'll say, that I encountered there that really you could see people already at that phase deciding if they're going to double down on their position or if they're going to kind of open themselves up to critique and potentially fundamental critique. And that's really there was a really formative shift there, and that was, I don't know if either of you were involved in sort of the immanence transcendence debates in some of those blogs, but that was, I could see that. I could see the critique of the typical notion of transcendence, in which we could say, yes, God is this transcendent mystery, but somehow the church was always the gatekeeper, always the mediator, always the one who could say, what exactly that mystery was going to look like. And so it was those people pushing against that to say that, is there an internal and an imminent way that we can be held accountable, that the church can be held accountable and theology can be held accountable, that I just wasn't seeing. And so I really felt I needed to pursue that for my own formation. And so I would say a lot of this project, even though I've left some of those sources behind, maybe was really formative for that trajectory.
that's cool. It's actually there's such a funny like media history project for someone to do there with all of these like wild blogs from the 2010s. Anyways, listeners of the Magnificast will definitely like what you find in David's book. You got Adam Kotsko, you got Marika Rose, all of the all of the blog heroes are there. And not and post blog heroes even. So it's great. Good stuff altogether. Well, let's talk about the book a little bit more, maybe at the surface level to begin. So there's a lot going on just with the title itself, and maybe we can talk through the title and some of those themes. So the title, Nothing Will Save Us, A Theology of Immeasurable Life. And you just mentioned a minute ago that, your book is dealing a lot with the idea of idolatry and sort of the critique of those sources of idolatry and like the types of authority that come with it. So I wonder if you could talk us through both pieces of the title, the Nothing Will Save Us
Sure.
bit, that's maybe more about idolatry, and then the Theology of
Yeah.
Immeasurable Life bit after it. That'd be great.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I've for some strange reason I was sort of a sucker. I've always loved biblical studies more than theology, and enjoyed researching Leviticus and sort of Pentateuchal sort of images of holiness, and really got taken in by that basic idea of so what I talk about in terms of idolatry and this nothing is that we think of books like, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers as being so baroque in the type of symbolism, the amount of laws, all of this detail, and yet it's very explicit that at the holiest place where it talks about, above the mercy seat between the wings of the cherubim, that is where God speaks. That's what it says, and so that space is meant to be kept empty. Where in other spaces you would literally have a figure, an idol, a form. And so I found that sort of a fascinating idea, and then to realize in the biblical text, idolatry was always the default. It's arguably whether Israel ever practiced the prohibition of idolatry consistently. And so there's this idea that that's the human tendency to want to control the form of value and measure for the world, that we had our handles on that. Um, and so, and again, even biblically, the definition, this is in the prophets, this is in Psalms, an idol is known by its results, which is that you become like it. That is, you become more dead. You can't breathe, you can't sense. And so I sort of came with that definition that an idol extracts life from the living, whereas holiness distributes life outward. And so that, gave me a pretty good handle on applying that in contemporary economic systems, as well as seeing that in the gospel, in sort of this, when you think of just the incarnation, this idea that God came, again, as we always say, an unmarried young woman without status in a, back lane kind of thing, that is where this holiness is literally birthed. And we obviously see it in Jesus' ministry. And so, that for me, that arc from this potentially arcane, ancient Israelite theology connected very quickly to liberation theology's preferential option for the poor, and just the idea that that's necessary because of our tendency towards our default towards idolatry. And then the subtitle is sort of the flip side of that there are spaces that the world has excluded, has discounted as, so again, to cite some old blog heads, Anthony Paul Smith and Daniel Barber have a great article from 15 years ago, Too Poor for Measure, where they talk about that poverty as a potential, as a site that is outside of the way the world determines our measure, and again extracts life from us. And so again, a lot of the book is being very careful not to romanticize poverty, not to call this some communion of saints, but to say these are theologically holy sites from which we hope life can be distributed, because they're not so immediately captured already by the world's measure. So I think that's sort of where the two titles interact with each other.
Yeah, it's really neat too, how you pull those theological categories into dialogue with a variety of ways that, we have these structures that try to measure life, as you put it, whether that's the economy or other kind of constructions of nation building, and kind of different categories that we use to parcel out life in all these controllable ways or dominating ways, and trying to preserve that immeasurability of life, and saying that that's kind of a Christian task or a liberative task, I think is a really unique way of I guess, figuring out how to deploy those Christian attitudes in a society like ours. You talk about, for example, structural violence, which I think, Matt and I talk about in the context of things like, I don't know, Marxism or the left-wing theories that help you decide what are those structures and how do they do violence and so on. But it was really helpful to see you bring in some of the kind of biblical examples showing ancient communities being able to critique the limits of individual responsibility given that structural violence. Can you maybe give us a little bit of I guess, talk us through that? Like, what's the biblical critique of structural violence?
Yeah, for sure. I think there was a kind of trajectory for myself again. Like it was, it started with learning about sort of a biblical concept of heaven, which again is not very all that similar, is not, I would, very dissimilar to typical Christian concepts of heaven, in that you had the heavens and the earth in the ancient world, and the heavens were sort of this realm of power that reflected an order, but not a perfect order, that you had to discern changes you could possibly participate in and influence in different ways. So you had this whole structure that for me came to understand more like heaven as a way of talking about politics, that we live in an environment that has pressures and forces that we acknowledge, that we say are kind of human made, but they form us as much as we form them. And so there's still kind of a mystery in that, to use that Paul's language of the powers and principalities kind of thing. And then it was just sort of fascinating. I had never noticed. I spend a lot of time talking about the divided kingdom of Israel after King David, and that the formation of the northern kingdom, and even geographically, what's interesting is the southern kingdom that still had the temple. The temple was the center. But the northern kingdom, is we are told, was literally founded on idols, and those idols formed a type of capture. So there was an idol to the extreme north and an idol to the extreme south. So it meant to kind of capture, hold the people in there, and then you start walking through every king, and most of the kings of the south are also dismissed, but all of the kings of the north are, from brutally violent kings to relatively banal kings. Every one of them is said to have caused the people to sin because of these idols. And I found that fascinating. Like I wasn't expecting the Bible to actually, give me some of the resources that I felt I was leaning towards. And so, yeah, that really, I just kind of found that fascinating, and really, again, led to what I think is a pretty identifiable biblical trajectory. And then I, bring that into conversation with a number of modern and critical theorists in terms of developing that. Yeah.
It's a cool chapter. I liked it a lot. It made me, I don't know, I've read First and Second Kings in my life a few times, and every time it's awful. It's a bad experience. But you've given me a little bit of something to look for in that text that makes it a bit more manageable, and I deeply appreciate that. Really doing your pastoral duty on that one. Maybe we can pivot though and talk a little bit more about the immeasurable life bit that kind of comes through in your book. You mentioned a little bit ago that there's sort of this orientation about the idolatrous, where it's like you can't move, you can't breathe, you can't really change or adapt, and but on the opposite side, you have this other type of life-giving authority that is far better and different. There's this quote that you have about the gospel that I thought was really cool, that really made me, I don't know, pause and think about what you were saying and what was going on in your argument in your book. This is at the end of your chapter on Christian supremacy, and you say this. I'll just read the quote. You say that the good news is the excess, possibility, or difference that emerges among those misaligned with the present powers. I think that's a cool line, and it's actually, I think, a very illuminating definition of the gospel. I don't know. Would you mind just kind of talking us through this definition and how this relates
Sure.
to the immeasurable life part of your book?
Yeah, I think that chapter in particular is one of the older sections of my writing that I've developed, that was in large part, again, my own formation of I guess back then, I don't think we were calling it deconstructing our faith or whatever, but it was seeing how even like I'm in a pretty liberal denominational setting that has a pretty good bent towards issue questions of social justice and things like that. And yet I was seeing just even in our most basic literature as a denomination, I would always pay attention something whenever we were articulating something good, it was always this idea that the good flows from the church to the world. We had that at one point, just even in our kind of one of our guiding denominational statements. And it was just sort of that question of, what would it be for me to hear the good news, and just as simple an orientation of that, what would it be for me to feel accountable to the good news? And so I just had to begin to think of it as something that just moves in any direction necessary, regardless of institution or individual or things like that. And so yeah, then I saw something that is, and part of the book too is always this wrestling with we necessarily work with institutions, and yet institutions necessarily are resistant to what I think the gospel is. And so that's again part of that. And so when you move out into spaces of people who have been so abused or just violently oppressed by systems, you begin to see the possibility of different movements again in a way that I don't want to be naive about, but it's holiness also is something that I think undoes you. That's like Isaiah 6 is a big image for me, where Isaiah finds himself in this vision in the Holy of Holies, and woe is me, I'm undone. And when holiness goes out, it undoes the world. It levels the world until there's just a stump left, right? And so these spaces, yeah, they're excess, they're possibility, they're not, you can't quite lay them out in institutional formats, even though that's inevitably what we'll work with. And so it's going in those spaces and being really careful, like being like, as I was thinking about this meeting, like thinking like these are actually holy spaces in a way that for me as a a white male Christian. So in my context in Winnipeg, we have, I think, one of the largest urban Indigenous populations in probably North America, even in terms of hard numbers, not necessarily even proportionally. And those are some of the spaces I try to work in. And I went to one recently where I'm just like, I don't know that I actually belong here. Like, I don't want to profane this space. Like, I don't try to say that in some pious way, but I was just like, I don't, and just you need to have a humility in that too. And there's, been some great relationships and great opportunities that come in that, but they're really powerful places. And that's just, not something to take lightly, that they are misaligned with the powers of the world in a way that they're not letting themselves be, oppressed and victims, and they're seeking something else, but they are outside of that structure in a lot of ways, for better or worse, at times. And so it's acknowledging that those spaces exist. When I talk to I did a book study with a church that was mostly in the suburbs, and I just talked to them about, how does basic property values affect who can be in your neighborhood and who can't, and just learning about, we like to be very aligned with the powers. We want a return on our investment. We want a certain type of security, but then just that always creates a misalignment for others. And how do we enter into those spaces and become aware of them?
Yeah, you mentioned your context in Winnipeg, speaking of spaces, and I think something I really enjoyed about the book is how much investigation there is of Canada in particular in the book. There have been a handful of Canadian liberation theologians in history that I, as an immigrant to this country myself, have learned and appreciated, trying to make sense of this place that I am now also a citizen of. So it was really nice to just have some more resources, I guess, to keep thinking about that, to think about Canada. And your approach really kind of gets into the violent logics and structures that underpin the Canadian state and imagination. There's a point in the book where you point out that, Canada is a pretty young state as far as state formation in a kind of explicit way goes. And so that means also the violence is not as far back. There's a kind of, I don't know, contemporaneousness to it that lets you criticize it a little more directly. What do you think it means to think theologically about Canada specifically? Like, what's it like to deploy a lot of resources used to think about other places that don't often get used to think about Canada?
Yeah, that's been an interesting process as well. Like, first of all, I mean, there's the whole internal process, like having, you know, as our immediate neighbors to the south, we get sort of overwhelmed with your media and history and content and thinkers and all of that. And so part of the process for me has been just learning my own history better and, you know, going through that first wave of I'm old enough that I grew up. I don't think I would have heard a thing about, residential schools in my growing up. There would have been, I would have had a bit of a sense that, oh, maybe the indigenous people got shortchanged a bit. That would have been the extent of it. And so I had a period of learning from indigenous decolonial thinkers, and then there was sort of this next layer of realizing like, oh, but there was also alternative histories that were possible, like before the whole like nation building of Canada sort of moved across the West. There was more of a mutual stories of more mutual exchanges between Europeans, French, British, and indigenous populations where there was potential for other trajectories. Here in Winnipeg, we refer to ourselves as the homeland of the Métis Nation. That was a nation built through the marriages and the blending of Indigenous and European traditions that ended violently with Louis Riel trying to stand for that type of vision. And so part of it was also learning some of the alternatives that could have happened. But a lot of it is now like, how do we, a lot of Americans look to Canada as a sign of hope. They looked to Carney's speech at Davos as, wow, someone, standing up to Trump, naming the truth of the illusion that's, been the international rules-based order. Whereas Carney just ends with, well, we're going to increase the military, we're going to extract more resources, we're going to invest in AI. And it's just, yeah. And all the while, yeah, post-COVID Winnipeg, I think our homeless population doubled. We had, I don't know what it was for other cities, but that winter, all the bus shacks were filled with people that I think a lot of them newly displaced. And, again, yeah, the Indigenous history is short. The memory is still acute for people who had relatives in residential schools, people, so much family members going through the prison system, many needing to work through kind of gang structures to find, a sense of their own, stability in different contexts. And so so it's a tricky place to try to feel like maybe we have something to offer for our US neighbors, but like it's not a sustainable trajectory, and it's not what Christians should be advocating for. Like I think Carney's maybe as good as we could hope for as a politician who would get to that position, but that is not what we should be advocating for.
Cool. Well, maybe switching gears here just a little bit. Maybe we can come back to international politics in a bit. Who knows? But let's see. You're a Mennonite pastor, which I think features in a really interesting way in this book. And I don't know. Mennonites sometimes get pegged as just like the pacifist theologians, and that's kind of it, right? without much distinction or differentiation. That's like the generalization that people will bring to the Mennonite tradition, rightly or wrongly. But peace is a big concern for your book in a big way, but I think in a very like creative and interesting way that I don't know, challenges some ways that people frame Mennonites or Mennonite theology. So how are you engaging with the Mennonite tradition in your book? I guess where do you find that in conversation with your own tradition?
Yeah, I actually talked to my publisher a bit about that. Like, do we promote this as a Mennonite theology? Like, I am not a scholar of the Mennonite tradition. I am a part of the Mennonite tradition. So it's in a lot of ways, I sort of take it de facto because peace is a big concern. Questions of social justice, I, and in terms of history, like Thomas Muntzer is sort of my spiritual heir to Anabaptism, and increasingly scholarship is acknowledging his place within the Anabaptist tradition, and a lot of his early um, people that followed him directly definitely were Anabaptists, and so that was clearly, for those who don't know, Thomas Muntzer was a minister who ended up on the front lines and organizing in the midst of the peasant revolution in the 1520s and was decapitated for it. And there's a lot of his work still isn't in translation, but there's enough of it that you can read that I hate reading Reformation theology. Like I don't know a lot of it. I can't stand, but it reads really well, and it reads kind of a whose side are you on in terms of the church when it's the powers of the world and the peasants trying to organize and stuff like that. So that's where I kind of take my Anabaptist heritage, and then I often think like as much as anything, this is a biblical theology, which I consider that to be a very Mennonite thing to do as well. And so yeah, I think as Mennonites, we're still maybe finding our feet now in the wake of, we had John Howard Yoder as sort of the one putting us on the map, and now, as so many knew for so many years that was this was not a figure to hang your hat on in terms of his conduct and ultimately his theology. And there was, again, to think back to that 10, 15 years ago, it was just a whole cottage industry of Yoderian, theologies coming out. And it's kind of curious now, like there's pretty good history coming out, but there's not as much Mennonite theology that I'm aware of anyways. And so it's I think potentially a bit of a new period for Mennonite theology as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that because I guess that never occurred to me that Yoder was kind of the guy who had the monopoly on what it meant to be Mennonite or to think like a Mennonite. And maybe there's like an opening to figure that out, even if there's not some other standout character, which may not be such a bad thing. And I mean, we have followed each other kind of at a distance for some time, and I've been very interested in your own explorations of Muntzer. And maybe you could just say a little bit more about that. Like, what is it like to talk about Muntzer among other Mennonites? I mean, it strikes me Mennonites they're the Mennonites, like they like Menno. So what is it like to be a Muntzerite among Mennonites? Is that how you would describe yourself? Does that make any sense? How's Muntzer getting received these days?
Yeah, there's been Canadian Mennonite University based in Winnipeg. They had a visiting scholar from somewhere in Europe. Can't remember now um, who actually walked through the reception of Muntzer in kind of Mennonite reception history, theological history, and talked about the need to claim him as he is often simply excluded. He's not counted among the martyrs in Martyr's Mirror, for instance, which is, there's a lot of folks in there. It's a big book. He wasn't in there. And I would say, even Menno Simons, that's only actually there's not a lot of histories of Simons. There's actually Pandora Press who did my book. I think there'll be one coming out. And so we're sort of like a Harold Bender Anabaptist vision is still our sort of, I would say the majority of my denomination, that's the type of Mennonite. And so is sort of a bit of the liberal therapeutic deism kind of, is that the term that used to go around? And so that's sort of so it's more kind of liberalism that I have to engage with, certainly in my context. And there's great graces in the width of conversations we can have and the spaces we try to make, but there's certain clear resistances in terms of anything that feels too overtly political, that that's where I see Muntzer coming in, who was very, very overtly political, and we see that now, obviously with the clergy in Minneapolis, and the idea that there does come a time, certainly, and maybe with that time should come sooner so that we don't get to other times, kind of thing.
Yeah, cool. Not too long ago on the podcast, we talked about Andrew Drummond's book, The Dreadful History of Judgment
Mm,
of God on Thomas
yeah,
Muntzer, which
yeah,
is extremely badass. That's a great book. Um, I have never been so interested in what happened in 1500 or whatever. It's
yeah.
great, an exciting one. He's got some great translations of some rare Muntzer pieces as well that are quite fun. So definitely a great thread to pull on if you are interested in that sort of thing. Once again, switching gears a bit, you draw from a wide range of traditions and sources to articulate a critical posture toward Canada and Christian supremacy throughout your book. Not just like not just these great 2010 blogs. There's a lot more depth to your work than all of that. Not to say they're not good, but I'm just saying your book is far deeper than that. But it is really cool to see a theologian, trying to work through challenging material of like the Black radical tradition or contemporary Indigenous writing on police and colonialism. You have some great sections in your book about not only abolition, but also about sex work that I thought was quite fascinating and like challenging for the Christian tradition in a very positive way. So I don't know, given the expansiveness of the topics that you're engaging with, like I guess who are some key figures who've helped inform your analysis? I guess how do you read those people into your faith, I guess, is maybe an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, and that, like, I haven't quite figured out why, like, even from an early age, I've just had an allergic reaction. I haven't Theology hasn't taken for me, like, kind of ever. Like, even when I was evangelical, as early 20s, I tried my hand there. I spent some time in the Anglican Church. I tried my hand with that. Um, and so it was really philosophy and critical theory that engaged me, like that just it made a certain sense. It made a way of a framework for engaging and interpreting and seeing the world that just it just made sense. And so I don't fully understand what that is, but yeah, there's been a great generation of Indigenous scholars in Canada. Leanne Simpson, Glenn Coulthard, in terms of the abolitionist, Robin Maynard, and Billy Ray Belcourt in terms of kind of poetry and fiction. I have a quote of his in the book that for me was what I think of the immeasurable. He was talking about this nation that he wanted to imagine, but he couldn't because Canada was in the way. And the way he talked about something that, again, resists, like, as soon as we put it into the language and the form of the day, there's something that's lost. And I think poetry has a way of kind of wrestling with that impossibility is what he was kind of talking about. Yeah, and then I find, and then it's just kind of on the ground. There are tremendous, activists and elders that will never get recognition, but just have tremendous wisdom. It's just you just encounter people with wisdom, and you just kind of want to listen then. And so that's been really formative. Yeah, and then broadly, there's a lot of the usual suspects of James Cone and Dolores Williams and Frantz Fanon and Saidiya Hartman, and so yeah, so these are, and again, I think the continuity for a lot of them is, like you said, it was a critical posture. Like, I just, again, this is mostly in hindsight. I didn't intend it in the book, but it was finding a form of judgment. Like, I think everyone has a default judgment, explicit or implicit, and it was trying to figure out how the gospel judges us and the world, and these thinkers I found very helpful for that.
Yeah, and I am curious too how that kind of feeds back into the stuff you talked about earlier, looking at some of those debates, from 15 years ago or longer, on how do we kind of take responsibility for Christianity or make it accountable to the claims that it's trying to make, and going out and finding voices external to the tradition, or not even external per se, but maybe willing to follow that track. Somebody like James Cone trying to figure out how to make Christianity accountable, white Christianity accountable for racism, etc. And then it's interesting to kind of see how all that stuff kind of comes into your own reflection on how to take responsibility for that. I think, like a lot of other folks we've had on the show, it's good to see Christians wading through Christian violence and how do we, I don't know, deal with the complexity of that. And I think a lot of our listeners too often tell us explicitly that's like the one thing in the show that everybody's trying to connect with and figure out. Like, everybody's trying to muddle through exactly that problem. I guess if you're still a Christian of some kind or other and you have a critical awareness, that's kind of your lifetime task, is how do you take accountability for that violence. It's tempting for people to insist on a true Christianity against a fake one, or to retreat into that sort of narrative that the church has all the answers, but you really take it all on board. So talk a little bit more about that task. How can we critically engage Christianity as Christians, and why should we bother doing that instead of just denouncing the bad guys as heretics or hypocrites or whatever?
Yeah, yeah, and for some people that may be the right path, right? To denounce it, to leave it, and to find another space and orientation that truly seems to engage and whatever your criteria is for that. And so again, for me and perhaps like others, I grew up conservative, moved through evangelical, went through liberal, and then by that point, a lot of my peers had either left Christianity, a number maybe had doubled down in sort of a more conservative frame, and I tried to take honestly that trajectory. Perhaps I do need to kind of discard this and leave it behind. And so I did to the best of my ability, I thought, to entertain that, and there wasn't anything there for me in any more meaningful way than I felt, I guess, called to, in terms of, like you said, that there both is an impulse of the gospel that is worth attending to, and there's an accountability of the church that is necessary. And so, yeah, it's having those two things, and I think part of it too is increasingly I do think about that again, that sense of the misalignments in the world, the contradictions, and that I guess that would be the kind of the dialectical thought or whatever, that trying to be honest, that we won't, and Mennonites were kind of, that was certainly one of our faults, is the idea that we could find a pure structure, that we could leave the world and figure out how to do it the right way, how to do it like Jesus taught, kind of thing. And so that was part of the reason of staying as well, is that I knew there wasn't a pure place to to find at the next spot. And so I think that the practice is always helping us, even congregationally, to be honest, to be like, okay, how much of this decision is based on meeting our budget, and how much of this is based on our vision as a church? And let's just be honest, and that's fine. And how much of this is based on our comfort level, and how much of this is based on, and just trying to walk people through that and try to face things as best we can. And yeah, like that's where to get back to Mark Carney, he always talks about being, speaking truthfully or speaking honestly. And it's very interesting to hear him talk about that. And I would use that similar language, but we have a different frame for that. But that is, yeah, that is how I see my practical work and my theoretical work is trying to be as honest as possible about, but then with and again, I guess that's the thing, like honest is variable on what you're paying attention to. And so that's where the gospel does direct our attention in a particular way to think about truth and to think about our place in it. So yeah, there hasn't been any sort of calling otherwise than to do my work here.
Yeah, it's interesting. Maybe we can talk a little bit more in depth about what some of this looks like practically. I mean, what you said about honesty is, I think, quite good. I like that a lot. Are there any other ways that you're interpreting, I don't know, Black liberation theology or or other big types of theological frames into your practical ministry? I mean, where does the rubber meet the road for you on some of these things?
Yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting. My congregation historically was very large. We sort of received a lot of the last big migrations of Mennonites to Winnipeg. Winnipeg, for those who don't know, is a major hub of sort of European cultural Mennonites for sure, as well as Mennonite churches. And it's always been quite diverse in terms of certainly socially liberal, conservative, some progressive folks. And even though we're much smaller now, I used to be a little bit frustrated. I liked that diversity again. Like I said, there's a certain space there that I don't think people find in some other churches, but there's certain limitations in terms of getting us all together on one thing, or we're gonna, we will disagree about everything. And so increasingly, I'm just trying to take that as, okay, here is my cross section of society. It's good to have to work over time with people with whom we have some political disagreements, and figure out what's really important. And I recognize I have potentially influential position in that. So again, it's doing two things. Like it's trying to, expose the challenges of liberalism. I think there's a lot of us, if you're in a middle class professional liberalism, life still feels relatively comfortable, and it can feel challenging to be pushed on that. And I think I moved from earlier, like probably a much more, finger wagging sort of judgment to sort of that Moten and Harney quote that was going around years ago that, or I was thinking it was Moten in an interview at the end of that book is, I'm not necessarily looking for an ally, but I want you to acknowledge this stuff's killing you too, and I'm like, okay, this measure of the world, this constant demand for return on investment, this constant demand for beauty and strength and improvement and all this stuff, this is not good for any of us. And to try to build that sense that, and that's pastoral care, right? Like that this is not healthy. And so I've tried to make that shift as well. Our, by virtue of our historic size, we have a large building that's close to downtown Winnipeg. A couple of years ago, I had a contact with someone who was building a small kind of grassroots organization doing workplace organizing, and they needed a place to meet. And so they started meeting at the church, and all of a sudden word got out, and we've got like 5 to 10 groups kind of using our space, a lot of which are doing very progressive organizing. And so that's been interesting. And so I've just kind of been patient and playing the long game on whether congregationally and facility wise there's some potential to learn from each other and support each other and stuff like that. So I've been at that church for 15 years, and I think some of it has taken that long to build up to that kind of capacity. So that's something I've been learning as well, a certain urgency in some areas and a certain patience in other areas as well.
That's so cool to hear. And I think there is a lot of, I mean, we talk about it on the show a lot, like what's the untapped potential of Christianity for bearing witness to that kind of struggle for liberation that we're talking about. And I guess, I mean, speaking of that kind of 2000s blogging moment, right? For some Christians, that potential is having the right idea or the exactly right theology or the kind of like perfect church polity. And if you get all that stuff right, you can sort of expect the rest of the world to pattern itself, or at least pattern yourself, in the right way. And I think what's really interesting about kind of hearing you think through or talk through what it means to think through this stuff, and then also what does that mean for having the practical responsibility of being a leader in a congregation and a pastor and responsible for that side of it, that maybe it commits you to just being a little more porous toward the world or porous toward other folks with some other visions or who want to organize and congregate in a congregational space. I think that's really interesting and exciting. And I guess that's kind of what we're always sort of like looking for on this podcast is like, where is it that Christians are figuring out how to, be like the leaven in the dough or whatever. Like Christians don't have to be the dough of revolution per se, or the dough of like the total alternative, but you're trying to, I guess, like help other things rise up a little bit, and insofar as you can do that, you should do that. How does that kind
Maybe,
of?
sorry, I was gonna
No,
say
go
maybe
ahead.
maybe we're even just the warm oven that can let it rise. Come
That's
on in the
right. That's
building.
right. Yeah, yeah. I guess I mean, what is that like also thinking through maybe this is a good question for the end of a podcast episode. Like what is that like thinking through the kind of future of something like Christianity, or at least Mennonite expressions of it in a place like Canada? Like liberal denominations are on the decline very rapidly, and not only like the Catholic churches too, save for immigration. That's the only reason that we're not in the same boat. And kind of what does that foretell maybe for how Christianity could continue to engage a society like Canada in particular?
Yeah, I don't I don't have the answer to that question. Um, yeah, it's, again, my role is increasingly like it's weird, being formed in an evangelical setting, discarding so much of it, and then coming back to a certain impulse of like there was an urgency to evangelicalism that liberalism just doesn't have. And yeah, I think in putting ourselves amidst different people and places, I think there's a question of risk. I think that's a big question for liberal and middle class folks in general. I don't think we see, here again, we have Carney, the new boss is same as the old boss. He's still bigger, better, economy of growth. And so, I'm looking to you guys now, the degrowth, thing. And so how do I build a culture that's going to accept there's a certain like there's already such risk embedded in the trajectory we have by the world, and it's just playing out on different people than for many of us. And so how do you move people towards a more embraced risk and an acknowledged risk, a calculated risk, even at that matter, to say that that's what it's going to need to make the kind of changes I think that we are called to as people of faith. So I think risk is actually a pretty big, um, question going forward for individuals and churches to discern well and to make decisions out of that aren't. And again, I think that's what I try to have us as a church often to be honest about, that these are often our decisions are based around kind of comfort and security, and just to name that and to consider what it would mean to take certain steps. Even there's a lot of the news going around, churches building more security and protection and stuff like that. And how do we even navigate those questions as downtown churches when we have elderly people and vulnerable people? We want safety, but how do we as a community accept a certain type of risk that I think our calling has embedded in it?
Thanks, David. That's a good word. I appreciate you coming on the show and talking through your book with us. Very interesting. Folks should go buy David's book, Nothing Will Save Us, A Theology of Immeasurable Life. Do you want to just, where can people get the book? Where can people find more information from you? What would you like to plug personally?
Yeah. So again, it's published by Pandora Press, which is an older publication of Mennonite Anabaptist material, but it has been in transition and is very small. And part of that transition has been that currently now, although there's changes, Amazon is its primary distribution place. So don't the publisher will tell you that in this instance, getting it off Amazon is fine, but it can be ordered to whatever your preferred store or online location is. Yeah. Otherwise, I don't know. I'm plugging away at stuff, but nothing that I can plug right now.
You can come back later and plug the next thing. That's the teaser. If you didn't get enough David today, don't worry. He'll be back with the new big project, whatever that might be, a great mystery for 2026. David, it's been great to get to know you better and have you on the show. We'll have to keep in touch, and people should go get the book. If you like this podcast, you're going to love this book. That is the Magnificast guarantee. It's a sticker you can print off and put on your book when you get it, and you can put that on your shelf. Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, and you should have because it was a good interview, you can go get David's book, Nothing Will Save Us, A Theology of Immeasurable Life. And you should get it. It's a great one. You can get a sticker, a Magnificast guarantee sticker. You can't. I don't know. Maybe we'll make one up. Why would we? Just for the bit? Who knows? Anyway, you can make your own sticker. I'm obviously losing the plot here. Go get David's book. That's the important thing that you need to know. You can also support us on Patreon at patreon.com/themagnificast. And if you do that, you can join our Discord community. Lots of good folks talking about good stuff. A lot of really helpful discourse this past week about what's going on in Minnesota in particular. It's been really valuable, actually, just to have a little spot to share anxieties and hope and organizing and prayer and all the rest of it. So you can find that, and also a lot of other nonsense and stuff about photography and your favorite vegan chili and whatever in that Discord. So get on over to the Patreon, support us there, come hang out. It's a good community. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong. The outro is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord.